I want a brand new, from the ground up, entirely new Ice Climber game. This has nothing to do with any prior history I have. This desire is stemming entirely from what I think Nintendo could do with a potential Ice Climbers game. I think, given the right idea and the right development team, an Ice Climber game could rival the sales, success, and acclaim of at least a Yoshi game, a Kirby game, or potentially even a Donkey Kong game. Let's talk about it. One of the unique problems of being a Nintendo fan is that there are so many iconic franchises within their history that it's hard for them to juggle those with the handful of massively successful heavy hitters that continuously do get supported with new games. For many, particularly Nintendo fans that stay up to date with all of their latest releases from these marquee franchises, it would almost be preferable for Nintendo to spend time, effort, and resources on keeping those less successful dormant franchises fresh with modern takes over releasing yet another game and their mainstays, despite the fact that they may also be massive fans of the bigger, more frequent releases like Mario, Smash, Pokemon, etc. And while they do dig up some gems from their past and are in the process of doing this for a few franchises, even these franchises have the stipulation that they needed to have at least at some point been actively supported by Nintendo. I would like to see what happens if, instead of reviving a franchise that is beloved by a cult following for a specific formula like Advance Wars or Metroid, what could potentially happen if Nintendo were to bring back a series that isn't known for decent enough sales or its stellar gameplay, but rather a franchise that is still held with some regard within the community for the characters and world within the franchise. I think Ice Climber fits that description perfectly because I'm gonna be honest, the original Ice Climber game on NES is straight up bad. Don't believe me? That's fine, you can go back and play it for yourself. It's pretty accessible since, unlike Metroid Fusion or Metroid Zero Mission, you can go do so right now on Nintendo Switch if you have an NSO subscription or the ability to redeem a 7-day free trial from mynintendo.com. Much like Kid Icarus Uprising, pretty much any Nintendo franchise with any level of mindshare within the Nintendo community has the potential to be completely reimagined and find some level of success with the right idea and the right people behind executing on that idea. So let's start answering some of these questions. Who are these people and what would this idea be? The development studio for the Ice Climber Switch game I would like to see in particular when I thought about it in the past has always been Retro Studios. For me, when I think of a studio the most suited to not only revitalize a dormant Nintendo franchise, as they've done exactly that 2 times over with their takes on the Donkey Kong franchise and the Metroid franchise before that, but also due to the unique appeal brought about by the marriage of Western and Eastern sensibilities that's inherent with a game from this studio, since they work so closely with Nintendo while retaining a high level of creative control. But for similar reasons, in addition to reasons I'll get into in a bit, the developer I would suggest for this particular idea now would have to be Next Level Games. This studio has similarly proven that they have what it takes to take the reins on a beloved Nintendo franchise for a new game that will be embraced and beloved by the fan base of that IP. They also demonstrated that they have some impressive technical chops, considering the fact that Luigi's Mansion 3 is still one of, if not the best looking game on Nintendo Switch, while also being one of the most mechanically interesting games with a structure that continuously introduces compelling new ideas for gameplay by way of its puzzles or other gameplay elements, many of which were made possible and increasingly more and more interesting by cooperative gameplay, which will become important in a bit. And even before they took over the Luigi's Mansion franchise with the last 2 releases, they have proven they have what it takes to make good games in a myriad of other genres with multiple other Nintendo franchises. And while we're on the topic of genre, I want to reiterate a suggestion I made on our podcast directly to you, which you can listen to every Saturday, linked in the description. Make the new Ice Climber game a cooperative survival game. I just think it makes the most sense in a series that centers around literally climbing mountains, something that is amongst the most physically taxing things a human being can do when we look at things like scaling Everest Everest, and the game has been associated with cooperative play from the door. I'd assume this is a given, but I want to be clear that I don't think it should be a simulation-heavy survival game. It should definitely have a Nintendo level of cartoon logic and wacky mechanics that can be found in even some of their more serious-looking games. There's a level of charm there that I think would be important to retain in a game like this if it hopes to succeed on a massive scale. I think a franchise that looks like Ice Climber playing like a real hardcore survival simulation type climbing game might turn a lot of people off. The presentation for this theoretical Ice Climber game could go in several different distinct directions that I personally would be very happy with, because perhaps the best decision Nintendo continually makes with their franchises is, for the most part, they create whimsical worlds that can be visually represented in whatever way they choose moving forward, and it would still work thematically every time. Nintendo rarely, if ever, shackles themselves to the need to emulate a specific thing like many other popular franchises that, say, aim for hyper-realistic graphics to the extent that a given generation of technology allows. For Ice Climber, Nintendo and Next Level Games could go in the full artsy direction with a painterly art style. Maybe something reminiscent of Inuit or Eskimo art to pay homage to the inspiration behind the Ice Climber characters. And preferably, they do so with the help of people that are actually a part of that lineage and culture. That's part of why I think Next Level Games, being a Canadian company, could play an important role in making this happen in a way that is respectful and equitable for the people that are a part of that culture. Of course, Next Level Games is located in Vancouver, which isn't a part of the northern region associated with this group of people, but as far as Nintendo-owned studios are concerned, they're the closest we have to being close enough to be able to make sure this gets done right. If this isn't something they'd be willing or able to do well for whatever reason, they could just as easily go with the more Pixar-adjacent 3D art style many other franchises tend to gravitate toward. It'd look good, obviously, especially with a studio like Next Level Games, but I gotta be real, it'd be the lesser of the two options I'd like to see most, although I'd understand if they opted for this out of respect. The gameplay would be centered around controlling both Nana and Popo, with the one that isn't being directly controlled by the player at a given moment being taken control of by an AI. And the level of their engagement would depend on the desire of the player. Like, if you'd prefer to play the game alone and manually switch to the other climber to complete a task, you can. There'd be an in-between where the AI will take control for moments when direct control isn't super interesting, like following the player-controlled character on flat land or assisting in combat with basic enemies. And then there'd be a setting on the other extreme end of the spectrum where the AI helps the player complete as many cooperative tasks as possible. Think a more advanced version of how Bowser Jr. functioned in Bowser's Fury. There should also be the standard systems to manage that are familiar in survival games like hunger, endurance, and what should be obvious in a game called Ice Climber, temperature. And I'm sure other things could be incorporated as well in this realm, but whatever they do in terms of systems, one thing needs to be true. Each of these systems shouldn't just exist in a vacuum for the sake of being true to survival. At the end of the day, they'd have to add to the fun of the game in some way, even if it's more of an abstract thing. They would have to gamify them in the same way that Breath of the Wild stamina system or range serve as inherent platforming puzzles. These both can be frustrating for sure, but when it all comes down to it, I'd say they add a lot to the full picture of the game, and for the people that understand and embrace the way they work, they can add to the experience in a very positive way. Being a Nintendo game and a game about climbing, it would no doubt be centered around a lot of platforming mechanics. Maybe there's some sort of emphasis on proximity to encourage the player to stay close to the other climber for whatever reason. They could toy around with communication, being a game that you can theoretically be separated from each other and would presumably need to be to solve some puzzles. And I think that time could play an interesting role in a game like this about climbing with two separate people that you are tasked with surviving and getting to the peak for whatever the MacGuffin is. Most important to this pitch, in my opinion though, would be that it would have to be a multiplayer game at its core that can be, as I mentioned before, experienced alone if a given player, Parker player decides they'd rather play it that way. And that multiplayer experience should be preserved not only in the old faithful for Nintendo, being local co-op, but also online. I mentioned the Hazelight Studio games the last time I talked about Ice Climber in a less dedicated video because their games are a good case study for how to do a game like this well online. I don't think Nintendo would use their business model in regards to one purchase of the game allowing friends online to play through the full game in the same way as they could if they bought it themselves, but Nintendo should absolutely follow the example those games set in terms of how well they work online. I can't speak to the experience of playing them locally, but I can say playing them online works phenomenally, and I think it actually says a lot that I enjoyed these games so much and never even thought to experience them locally. Nintendo is less consistent in this area, but they aren't incapable of making it work when it's a priority, so make it a priority, please. As far as this story goes, I'm sure this won't matter to Nintendo, so I'm not sure it entirely matters that much to me. It'll probably just be Nana and Popo want or need some sort of MacGuffin that will require them to make their way atop increasingly dangerous mountains across the world. Or maybe even one massive mountain, depending on the scope of each mountain in terms of gameplay, or the amount of things they can do to make climbing a given mountain interesting for the player. They have a lot of room in terms of villains if that's the direction they want to go in, since there's no set precedent, so they have the ability to do whatever they want here in terms of character designs. Same with supporting characters and other aspects of the story. The sky is the limit here. To be honest, I didn't put a whole lot of thought into what the story would be because, like I said, I don't think it would be super important to Nintendo, especially for the first game in the series. They tend to flesh stories out later on if a franchise ends up being successful. But I am interested in knowing what you guys would do for a story like this, so let me know that in the comments. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of this idea overall. What different gameplay mechanics would you introduce in a game like this? And maybe what was the favorite thing that I presented in this video for you personally. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate it if you shared it with a friend that might enjoy talking about the possibility of an Ice Climber game like this with all of us. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.